Hi and welcome to part 2 of my Cinema 4D Sketch and Toon tutorial. In this section we're going to go through Cinema's various different shading methods. In part 1 we already went through how to do the basic shading and get the lines around the outside of your objects, so go watch that video first maybe if that's what you're interested in. But in this part, we're going to concentrate much more on shading. So what we do for this is we use regular materials. Although we do have these special sketch shaders for the lines, this is not how you do your shading. All of the shading is done through just a boring old regular standard material. So I'm going to add one of these, put this back down there, and let's open up this material. Okay, so what we're looking at is in this texture drop down menu we have a sketch and toon section with 4 different things in. So we're going to go through all 4 of these. But the first question is, where do we put it? What material channel? Ultimately this is going to change how the colours of the object change, but it's also going to change how it illuminates it as well. So generally special effects, things which affect more than just sort of the colouring or the bumpiness of a surface, we tend to put those into the Luminance channel. So I'm just going to turn everything else off. I'm going to go to Luminance, turn this on, and we'll start off with our very first one in here under Sketch and Toon, and this is the Art Shader. Very pretentious name. Now the Art Shader, it's a bit of an odd one. What this is going to do is we're going to feed Cinema a picture of a ball, and Cinema will then scan that image, and because it knows it's going to be a picture of a ball, it therefore has every possible angle it needs. It knows what the top of an object should look like, it knows what the bottom of an object should look like. All bases should be covered. So we're going to be a bit lazy, a bit cheeky here. We're just going to fire up a web browser and we're going to just go and grab something off Google Images. So let's say we want our Sketch and Toon style to be either a watercolour or maybe a pencil sketch, something like that. Basically just either find, depending how morally bankrupt you are, or draw yourself a ball in the style you're after. So let's say I search for a pencil sketched sphere. Have a look at images, and I decide, right, I want my 3D rendering to be shaded with this kind of style here. Okay, that'll do me fine. So I'm just going to grab this image here just for demonstration purposes. Obviously you're supposed to definitely go and draw your own artwork, not just nick it from Google. So let's save this picture. Let's dump this on the desktop. And now we need to go over to Photoshop. You see, the image Cinema is expecting should be perfectly cropped. So I'm going to load this image into here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my crop tool, and we just need to trim off any spare space above and below, left and right. Don't worry about the corners, they're pretty irrelevant. We've just got to trim off all this white space. It doesn't matter if you trim slightly into the object, that's okay. But it's better we do this than we leave any white space around the outside edges. So let's just crop that. This here should do absolutely fine. And we'll save this out. We'll call this cropped sphere. And we'll keep as much quality as we can. We'll go for a PNG file. Okay, there we go. Right, so back in Cinema. So we're sat here. Let's actually get an object to apply this stuff onto. Let's go for maybe a stickman. Let's just give him some slightly better quality. Or maybe he's sitting in a rubber ring, floating around in the ocean. There he is. Right, so this is going to be our test subject. We'll apply our art material to both objects. And we're looking now at the Luminance channel. We have our art effect in there. What we need to do is we need to load in the texture. But be careful here. Don't just click the buttons off to the side and go and load the texture. What you've got to do first is click on the word art. So we're looking at the art shaders settings. And now in here, this is where we load our texture. So the very first slot we've got is asking us for an image. You can just click the button to the side and go and load it, or if you've got the image laying around somewhere, like I've got mine on my desktop just to the side here, you can drag and drop that into the texture slot and it will load it in that way as well. Do I want to copy it? No, not really. Leave it where it is. Right, there we go. So this will now be taking this sphere, and depending on the shape it's applied to, it will rearrange it so that the texture covers and shades the entire surface. This is one of my favourite shaders by far because it's so easy to use, it's so quick to get a pretty good result, and it just pretty decently shades the whole surface. Just a note on resolution. You may notice we've got a few stretchy bits here, maybe a few stretchy bits there. I would say generally the minimum resolution for this artwork of your sphere should be about 1000 pixels. If you go much smaller than that, you can see the one I've got here is only 500. You start to lose a bit of quality on any of the flat surfaces. They tend to sort of stretch out that texture a little bit too far. But if your artwork's at least a good sort of 1000, preferably 2, 3, 4000 pixels is better, you'll generally avoid these issues. But that's it. That's really about all there is to it. You just load in the sphere and Cinema will now apply that style to anything. I will say this does work a lot better with curvy objects than it does flat ones. I have chosen these two example objects for a reason. Because Cinema's looking at your geometry to determine what angle the surface is facing, it then picks out the appropriate piece of your image and applies it. The problem with a flat-sided shape is it's only ever going to pick out a really small, tiny little speck of this piece of artwork. So the resolution, I just have these massive, gigantic, chunky pixels. It's not going to look great. So this art system is good for curvy things, not very good for flat. If it's flat, just go find another way of doing it. Even if that is just simply shading in a flat piece of paper and simply applying that as a flat piece of artwork, that would work perfectly fine too. Okay, in terms of settings, not much to worry about. You can rotate it around. So keep in mind, by the way, what we can't do really is illuminate this. Whatever illumination we have in our original bit of artwork, so this thing's lit from the top right corner, that's the lighting you're going to get in your scene. I can add as many lights as I like. These lights just simply do not affect the scene because this has no colour to illuminate. It's already sort of pre-lit through the luminance. But what you can do is you can rotate it. So if this is lit from above, we can actually just rotate our artwork, spin it around, and we can now sort of make it look as if it's lit from underneath by just turning it around until the lighting of the artwork is down below. So that's at least one bit of control you do have. Other than that, the rest of the settings in here really not particularly useful. But yeah, there you go. There's your art system. So let's move on to the next one. So I'm probably going to keep my little guy in his rubber ring here. The next thing I want to show you, so I'm just going to dump this art shader now. Let's go into here and choose clear. Okay. The next thing in our list is the Cel Shader. Now, the Cel Shader, I will be honest, let's look at its settings. This, if you've already looked at Cinema's main sort of sketch settings, this is not going to be a million miles different. If you've already taken an object and added a standard sketch material, again, sorry, this is just going to be off the edge of the screen here, but I'm going to add a sketch material. You may have already been into the render settings, had a look at the sketch settings, gone to shading. You've got these sort of shading settings here with quantize options and gradient options for shading the surface. This is not a million miles different from the Cel Shader. The Cel Shader is really just going to give you a series of gradients to control how the surface, how the object actually gets lit. The benefit of this one, I guess, is you can now do it per object, or you can even apply multiple different ones to a single object. So you're going to get more control over it rather than just applying one big bland shading to absolutely everything in the scene. So let's have a look at what we've got. It's useful, but not hugely different. The default thing you've got is this gradient. Cinema is simply going to shade dark, medium and light areas with these colours. So let's hit ourselves up with a interactive render region, because this is not how it's going to look. Cinema's real-time view unfortunately isn't particularly good with this. But if I turn on the interactive render region, and we'll just pop him over there, draw a nice big box. Okay, and let's boost the quality up to the top as well. Okay, so you'll notice what we have is this gradient where everything is facing us. We've got this sort of highlighted area in the middle, and then it just sort of fades to the darker colours around the outside edge. This is Cinema's camera mode. It literally makes a gradient facing head-on towards the camera. If you're after something a bit nicer, a bit fancier, a bit more controllable, dare I say, turn off the camera mode and instead go for lights instead. Because now, whatever lighting you have in your scene, let's grab this light source, this will actually be illuminating our scene. It's still using the gradient, it's still using those same colours, but I can now move this light source around and get it to actually illuminate and light up the project. So let's go back to the gradient for a second. So now we've got it more controllable. Let's go back to the gradient. There's nothing necessarily wrong with this kind of gradient itself. It's just stylistically it's a bit harsh. These things will suddenly jump from bright to medium to dark with not really anything in between. But keep in mind, this is controlled with a regular gradient. So if I go to this diffuse and I unfold it to get more settings, what we have in here, first setting, is the one we're after, interpolation. How does it blend from one shade to the next? And at the minute you can see we've got none. So it's just making this sudden, quick, snappy jump from one shade to the next. If I choose something from within this list, and again, there's not much difference between anything in this menu. They're all kind of similar. So let's just go for the first one, Smooth Knot. This will change it from having a sudden change in the gradient to this nice, much smoother one. So you can see I've got a much smoother, nice, soft transition here. Everything's gone much shinier. Now, it's not necessarily that I want everything to look sort of all smooth and gradiented and blended. It's just that I didn't want this harsh, sudden, cel-shaded jump from one colour to another. But what we can do is we can make use, we can essentially get sort of a halfway house. You can see here, here with my gradient. If I just double up these knots, if I take this medium blue one and just put it up quite close to the bright one, I've essentially told Cinema, could you just change the shading a bit quicker, a bit more sudden? So basically do it within this little area here. You can see I've now got a nicer, softer edge to my highlighted area. The dark bit is going from this sort of nice medium blue to a very dark blue. Actually, that's not too bad. But if you did want a quicker, more sudden change, do the same thing again. Take your dark blue knot and put it very close to the medium knot. And you'll now get a much more sudden change. But it is now smoothly blending from one to the other. And of course, throw in whatever colours, however many different shades you like, and you can now get this nice, softer cel-shaded look on your objects. As for any other settings, consider that when you're illuminating your scene, there may be shadows. If I just kill this cel-shaded look for a second and just sort of plain white shade this, if my light has a hard shadow casting the shadow down onto the ring below, like this, it would maybe be nice for this to show up with my cel-shaded look. At the minute though, if I turn it back on, it doesn't. Shadows are just completely and utterly ignored. But that's just because we haven't turned the setting on. If I go into the Cel Shader, right where we turned on our lights, we can also turn on shadows. And there we go. He will now cast a shadow down onto the cel-shaded look. Likewise, let me just mention this illumination button because it is a bit confusing. The name isn't the best, although I understand what it does, but it needs a bit of explaining. Lights tells the system to use the actual light sources shining up above. There you go, you can see one reflecting in my glasses just there. This tells it to use the lights, but what it doesn't do is take into account how bright the light is. If I move this out of the way and I just go to my light and I say, look, let's make this light half as bright, nothing changes. It doesn't matter how bright or dark I make this light source, it always looks the same. Illumination, in my Cel Shader settings, this is essentially saying, please take into account how bright the light source is. That's all it does. So when I turn this on, initially nothing much will really change. But if I now dim my light down a little bit so it's not quite so bright, let's say halfway, it all goes much darker. Now obviously I've gone too far, so let me just turn it up a bit more. There you go. It's a fine line between darkness and lightness. Although do keep in mind, the reason this happens is because I have most of my gradient covered with darkness. If I shuffle all of this stuff much further left, and I have much more sort of light areas over here, then my light makes a bit more sense. This should be sort of fairly evenly distributed across your gradient, essentially. But yeah, so turning on the illumination setting allows the brightness of my light to actually make a difference to how bright the cel shading goes on my scene. And that should largely do it for this one, to be honest. It really is just a question of choose the gradient you're after, tell Cinema whether or not the lights and the shadows and the illumination should actually make a difference. By all means, use the light color as well. So if you need some warm lights and some cold lights, you can actually take into account the light color too. But that's about it really for the Cel Shaded shader. Let's move on to the next one then, shall we? So let's say goodbye to the Cel Shader. Goodbye. And next up in Sketch and Toon is the hatch shader. So let's throw one of these in. Now, the hatch shader, if you've used MoGraph before, explaining the hatch shader is easier. The hatch shader is for doing hatched shading. In other words, if you got a pencil and you wanted to shade something in, you could just get lots of little brush strokes to shade a surface. So you could put lots over here where it's nice and bright, and then really dark, heavy shading over here where the part of my hand gets darker. This is what we can do in Cinema. If I have a look in the hatch shader, the first thing, much like many of the others, is it's asking me for an image. So it wants to know what the brush stroke should be. Should it be a thin, long line? Should it be a big, thick, heavy smudge? And this is really up to us. So I'm just going to throw Photoshop up again. Let's lose the sphere. And I'm just going to make a new image. I'm just going to say File, New. A few hundred pixels is fine. I wouldn't go much higher than 1,000 though. In fact, I probably wouldn't go that high because high resolutions take longer to render. So yeah, let's say a few hundred pixels. And all I'm going to do is just draw a brush stroke. So using some sort of brush, let's go to our list here. What should we use? Oh, I don't know. Let's just pick any old random thing. Let's go for this. Okay, so a bit bigger. But I'm just going to draw in black and white. That's very important, by the way, black and white. I'm just going to draw boop. That's it. That's my brush stroke. So let's save this out. Save as on my desktop. We'll call this Brushstroke. PNG file is fine. Okay. So what we do back in Cinema, once we've drawn a brush stroke, is we load it into here. I'll just drag and drop this to be lazy. No, don't copy it. I must have pressed that dialog button a million times at this point. Right, okay, so let's take a look at what we've got. Our texture view shows us our brushstroke there. Our preview shows us a few brushstrokes, and our editor view shows us nothing much useful at all. So let's just turn off that render region so it stays nice and quick. Right. There's really sort of three things we do with this brushstroke. The first page here where it says shader, this is really just to determine how many brushstrokes I'm going to have, how large they should physically be, and sort of how densely packed they should get on the surface. The next couple of pages allow us to tint the colour and change them based on illumination, and this is sort of one of the key things for the hatch system. But let's get the distribution sorted first. Now, most things in here I'm hoping should be fairly straightforward. Just for those who have never gone into all this UV editing stuff, just think of U as horizontal changes and V as vertical changes. Left and right, up and down. And with that, hopefully most of the stuff in here should become quite apparent as to what it's going to do. So scale, I'll tell you what, let's right click here and open a window. Get a nice big chunky editing window up here. So scale, this is just going to be how big the entire pattern is. So imagine this is a piece of paper and we're just drawing lots of brushstrokes. This will give us an idea about how it's going to look on the surface. If I shrink the scale down to maybe 10%, we get lots of brushstrokes. Okay, so you can get an idea about how it's going to work now. It's just going to be drawing all these little ticks, all these little brushstrokes onto my canvas. We've then got density, which is really going to be how many brushstrokes we have. So at 100%, this is sort of generally, it's not strictly the maximum, but there are better ways for getting more beyond 100%. So let's just, for simplicity's sake, assume that 100% density is the highest we really want to go with this. This just lets us choose how many brushstrokes we're going to have. So 50%, half of them will just vanish. If we go down to 10%, we'll only have a few on there. But I'm just going to leave this at 100% because we tend to need lots of brushstrokes for this system to work nicely. You can choose how many you get specifically left and right on U and up and down on V. Maybe you want to do this. I've never particularly seen the need. Frankly, the density setting just by itself tends to be enough for this. Scattering, right. We've got a bit of random placement on this because we are randomizing them 10% left and right and 10% up and down. If I were to just get rid of these for a second, we'd get a fairly neat grid of them. So you can see what the scattering is doing. If I say, let's go 1%, 2, 3, 4, you can see them all just shifting left and right. Whereas this scatter V, the vertical one, this will now go up and down. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So use these two numbers to just basically randomize them as much as you want. If you go really high with this, keep in mind you will get lots of clusters all sort of overlapping and lots of big blank areas with nothing. So maybe don't go too mad with it. Sort of keep the numbers fairly conservative if you're trying to get a fairly even bit of a shading on your surface. Spacing, how far apart they are, again, not massively useful because it's not a million miles different from just density. If you add space, you have a less dense pattern. So really, there's not a huge difference between these settings. So we'll skip those. And then we've got scale. Now, this one, although it may seem, hold on, we have a scale setting. This one is a little bit more useful. Not because you can change the scale of the pattern sideways and vertically, but because you can add variation. So I can add more variation and say, look, could we stretch my strokes wider a lot? So I'll now get really thick chunky strokes and really thin ones. And likewise, I can do the same thing up and down. So it's maybe not so much that I want thick strokes and thin strokes. So I'll leave that quite low as far as variation is concerned. But if I say height, I can now get some really long strokes and some really short little diddy ones. So that's where this thing really sort of comes in useful. And then finally down here, rotate, one of the most useful settings. How would you like these things to be turned? Because right now they're all facing the exact same direction. If I turn on some rotation, maybe 10 degrees, this will give me a bit of variance in which direction they go. So yeah, again, just throw in whatever number you like, maybe 45 degrees, get a bit of variation in there. Although if you're trying to make it look like various brush strokes, they all tend to broadly go in the same direction. So if that's your aim, maybe don't go too far with this one. And the last bit at the bottom, crosses, this just tells Cinema to sort of try and make crisscross patterns. So if you draw a stroke perfectly in the middle, Cinema, rather than just putting strokes here and there and everywhere, it'll always try and make sort of little crosses, as if you've gone cross, 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 and you sort of overlapped yourself. Not that different, to be honest, from just cranking up the rotation setting by itself, but it's there. Okay, and just one last little thing. Depending on the pattern you've made, you may notice that some of these strokes on certain sides, it just never really crosses the border. Turning on tile allows this pattern to sort of wrap back around to the start and repeats and loop over and over again. So tiling can be useful. You've just got to be careful with it, because you can also find that sometimes it makes a bit of a heavy line along the left hand side and the top. So try it with it turned on, try it with it turned off. You might find it either makes things worse or it improves any gaps you've got. So just be a little bit careful with that one. I'll leave it turned off for now though. Right, okay, so that's your basic pattern. And if you want, by the way, you can just use this. This could be stubble on someone's chin if you're doing a cartoon character. This could be sort of random markings or damage on a wall. So just using this as a sort of simple scattering texture can be useful. But we're going to go on to the next pages, because for me this is Cinema as a 3D software, and for me it's all about the lighting and the shading and the shadows. And this pattern, this flat image, just, well, it doesn't have any. So let's jump on over to these next two pages. We're going to skip over the color settings really quickly because it's incredibly basic. This just lets you color things up. What it's going to do is look for the black and the white, and it's going to say, look, dark stroke color. Well, maybe I want them to be blue. There you go, they're blue. Or pink. They're pink. And the other one is background color. What color should the white bit be? Well, maybe light blue. So, you know, there you go, that's it. It just lets you color up the strokes. Ignore the one in the middle, we'll come back to it, or at least I need to still explain what it is, but dark strokes and background is your hatch system. So, on to the last page, the fun bit. Now, just before I go any further with this, I'm going to project this properly. You've noticed perhaps that I've got these big chunky strokes on my torus and these very little ones on my stick figure. You do have to either texture your object properly or set up some UVs. I'm just going to be really lazy, and I'm going to say to both of these textures, could you two guys, 1, 2, could you just throw yourself flat on the front of the artwork? So there you go, that'll do me. Frontal. So you can either go flat in one direction, like X, Y, and Z, or if you go for frontal, it'll just sort of slam it on from your point of view. So let's give that a quick test. Okay, so let's throw in our render region. Turn this back on. Now, you'll notice that all of these patterns are just slapped on blandly, flatly onto our objects. There's no shading, there's no lighting here. We can turn this on. In Illumination, what we do is we say, what should affect the shading of this effect? So 9 times out of 10, you're going to want your lighting to affect the shading on the surface. So let's turn on light mode. These, by the way, are pretty much the same settings from our Cel Shader and our Art Shader, and to be honest, in the next one we're going to get to the Spot Shader. Okay, so let's make our light affect the object. And to begin with, this doesn't look like much. What we need to do is layer up multiple layers of all these little hatch shading specks, and then this will create the shading. So right now we have one, to be honest, level is not the best word. I would have said layers, because this is literally going to layer things on top of each other. So there's 1. If I bump it up to 2, that's 2, and let's keep going. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Hopefully at this point you can start to see my light over here is kind of somewhat illuminating the surface. We're using these shaded specks as our shadow. And I'll tell you what, let me just lose all that colour I added. Let me make the background white and make the strokes black again. Okay, so we're literally putting all these little marks onto the surface to make the shading. And if I just sort of skip ahead and say, look, let's go for 10 levels, or maybe let's go for 15 levels. It will get a bit slower as we keep going up because it's got more work to do. 20. Okay, now we're really starting to get our shading in there. Maybe let's sort of stop at about 25 or so. Ooh, okay, fine. Let's stop at 20. Apparently there's a limit. If this is still not dense enough, by the way, this is where you can nip back into your shader settings and bump up the density over here. So if I need a bit more, maybe let's go 125% density. Is it just me, or did that get less dense? We'll leave that one at 100 for now, shall we? Let's call that one a bug. Okay, back to our illumination. So in here, settings-wise, so we've got our lights shining down, creating illumination. These settings are all the same. I can say, could you please include some shadows? And we should now get the shadow cast onto the background. Could you please use the illumination of lights? So again, right now, Cinema does not take into account how bright the light source is. Turning it on means that the brightness, the intensity here would suddenly have an effect. Those are your main settings down there. But we've got two settings at the top here. Show dark strokes and show light strokes. So right now we have this light area, and then all the darkness is being caused by these dark strokes appearing on the surface. You can have both. You can have both black dark strokes shading in the shadows, and also not just a blank slab of white for the bright areas, but white inverted strokes for the light section. So to make this show up a bit better, by the way, first of all, I'm going to try and get rid of this big slab of white over here. So I will just mention this threshold. This is essentially it's how much of the color range it should use. So right now we're only using 80% of the brightness range. Once the light hits 80% brightness, it just bleaches out into pure white. So let me just boost this up to 100 because it gives you a wider range of illumination. So this big slab of white there should now have much more of a shading within there. So I'm going to turn on light strokes, and what you'll hopefully notice, let me find an area where this will show up. Let's go over here. Rather than just a white canvas with black strokes on there, we can now also have white strokes. So this will get rid of that sort of faded, gradiented look which kind of flows through it all. If I turn that back off again, you may have noticed we had these very sort of half-faded strokes here and half-faded strokes there. If you're not a fan of those, turn the light strokes on, and instead they will be covered up and redrawn over the top with new light strokes. And this is giving us quite a nice sort of harsh, gritty, very shaded look. Maybe my strokes are a bit too heavy, there's too many of them, so I would perhaps reduce the number of shading levels. And if this is all starting to go a little bit too light and a bit too bright, we can play around with this diffuse. So if I think my image here is too bright, just either lean this to the dark side or the light side to make it sort of get lighter and darker. That would have an effect. Or if that's still not enough, maybe consider not having black and white as our limits. You can see here I've still got this big slab of white. If I swap my white diffuse illumination, so diffuse, by the way, that's just like standard lighting. If I swap the white for just a bit of a slightly darker grey, that should lose that big bright area there. And likewise, if I don't like the black, I could boost up the black and raise the dark areas. Now do keep in mind, this is a very contrasty image I've gone for here. If I tone my colours down a bit, maybe I'll make the white bits... well, actually, this is probably a good time to mention this extra colour here. So we've got black for the dark strokes, white for the light strokes, And now at this point, the background maybe shouldn't be white. It should maybe be something a bit more of a halfway house. So if I set my sort of neutral background to a grey, I'll now have black bits for the shadow and white bits for the illumination. So this maybe also helps explain the light strokes and the dark strokes. But there you go. So yeah, so we could maybe make the dark ones not pitch black. Maybe that's a bit too dark. Let's add a bit of a lightness into there. And maybe the white ones don't have to be pure white. We could tone those down to a light shade of grey, perhaps. Give it a second, let it render, and there we go. You can start to get this this nicer look. But if you throw in the right artwork, you could get a nice cross-hatched, gentle, pencil-shaded look to your surface, and any other sort of hand-sketched style you're interested in. Anyway, there we go. That should do us for the hatch shader. So on to the final bit now, the final home run, and this one will be quite a quick one. So let's say goodbye to our hatch shader. We'll keep the scene again. The final thing in the list is the Sketch and Toon spot shader. Now, as soon as I add this, it all goes a bit weird. We just have these big black and white squiggly wavy lines. And to be honest, this is just because our spot pattern is so gigantic. Let's jump into the spot shader and go straight. Let's make a beeline. Just fold some of these down. We don't need to see all these details. Let's make a beeline for the scale. Okay, so we have 100% scale at the minute. Let's turn this down significantly. Let's go down to about 10%. Right. Now hopefully you can see what we're aiming at here. The spot shader is going to make a series of spots, circles, which get larger or smaller in order to generate the shading on the surface. Because the texture is square and I have a widescreen project, the spots are being stretched out into these wide circles. Let me just beef them up a bit for you. So my spots aren't round. So here you've got U and V, width and height. You can use these to squash and stretch them into the correct aspect ratio if you need. So what are we doing, 16 by 9. So if I go sort of about 65% width, that should squash my circles back roughly into circles once again. And just while showing you this example, you may notice, if you have a closer look, I'm not sure how much YouTube's going to butcher the quality here, but yeah, I have some very jagged pixels. If you're going to use Cinema's spot shader, one big bit of advice I can give you, in your render settings, go to your anti-aliasing and bump it up to best. This will improve the quality of all these circles quite noticeably. And to be honest, I may actually come back in here and increase the quality even further. It depends how it goes. But sometimes you've got to bump up the max, and you've even got to bump up the minimum, because the spot shader, it requires a lot of detail. So let's bump this back down to 10%. We now have all these circles creating the shading. And to be brutally honest, it's very similar to what we've already seen before. You can choose, does the shading just face the camera? That's what the camera checkbox is. Or we could turn this off and turn on lights and say, nope, you should face the light source instead. Should it take into account specular highlights? Should it make shadows? So if I turn on the shadow setting, you'll now get this dark shadow on the background again. And should it take into account how bright the light sources actually are? Should it take the illumination into account? So those settings are all the same as the ones we've seen before. In terms of other bits and pieces, it's really just a question of choose a shape. Do you want this to be a series of circles? Do you want a sort of diamond pattern? So let me make this a bit chunkier so you can see it more easily. Yeah, so you do want this diamond pattern. Do you want some squares? Do you want a series of lines? This is the kind of shading they'll use on banknotes, for example. They get these lines which get thick and thin to do the shading. This one in particular does need very good anti-aliasing. If I shrink this down to a much more reasonable size, which would be about 5–10%, the quality is really a bit iffy. So you're going to have to jump into your render settings, and it tends to be the minimum which doesn't do the job properly. So if I boost the minimum anti-aliasing, let's go for 2x2. That should immediately help. Go further, let's go 4x4. Okay, still not enough. Let's bump up the maximum. Let's say maximum 8x8. This is not something you would generally ideally do in most situations. However, Sketch and Toon renders usually so fast anyway that even with these absurdly high anti-aliasing settings, our render times are still pretty reasonable. I mean, this takes 5 seconds, so yeah, I'd be happy with that. And there we go. We've now got a decent quality, especially compared with how it originally looked, which was this. So yeah, go for best and crank up those quality levels. You can see it coming down there now. Okay, so yeah, so choose a pattern. By the way, you can choose texture, which allows you to load in your own artwork. So just give it a black and white picture, and you can use your own bit of artwork for this shading style. But I think more or less that is about it. So I hope this has all been useful. I hope this has let you learn something new about Sketch, which maybe you didn't realise was there. This is Mash from 3D Fluff. I'll see you in the next video.